Todd and his family are preparing for the downside of Y2K should it come to pass.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at moments from the mid-20th century and beyond that made the world stand still.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the cost of worldwide nuclear war.
Chernobyl Disaster.
Good evening. Here's what's happening tonight. The Soviets are saying little, but what is known is cause for concern. A nuclear accident has occurred at a Soviet atomic plant in the Ukraine.
It is believed serious, but details of damage, injuries, or casualties are few so far. Eyewitness News reporter Liz Gonzalez has more on this accident, what is thought to be the first such accident the Soviets have ever made public.
The explosion of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant's number 4 reactor remains, 40 years after it happened, the most devastating nuclear disaster of all time, as well as the costliest of any kind. Brought on by an ill-advised reactor cooling test, at least 30 deaths have been attributed to the events at Chernobyl, whether directly or by acute radiation sickness after the fact.
The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia. We begin with ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies.
Beyond its tragic significance, which led to the abandonment of the town of Pripyat, the disaster led to widespread distrust of the Soviet government, amid backlash for its efforts to cover it up. Chernobyl still looms large in the public imagination for the destruction it wrought, and as a reminder of the fearsome power of nuclear energy.
Well, it was just 4 hours ago when Soviet viewers were watching their evening news bulletin and the announcer revealed that the accident had taken place. The official news agency TASS later added that aid was being given to those affected. The accident was at Chernobyl, a town of around 50,000 people.
Malaysia Airlines Flight 370.
Breaking news tonight, a Malaysia Airlines flight with 239 people on board, including 4 Americans, has gone missing. At this hour, a desperate search is underway for MH Flight 370, which departed Kuala Lumpur at 12:41 a.m. local time and was due to land in Beijing at 6:30 a.m.
38 minutes after takeoff from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, the crew of this 777-200ER made what they didn't yet know would be their final transmission to the outside world. Flight 370 never arrived at its destination in Beijing. And the scariest part is that literally no one knows for sure where it ended up.
CBS News' Tony Aiello is here with the latest developments. Tony.
Mary, the United States and 12 other countries are aiding in this search, with 57 ships and 48 aircraft scouring Southeast Asia for any sign of the missing plane. CBS News has learned the disappearance of flight MH370 increasingly looks like a deliberate act.
Described as the greatest aviation mystery of all time, the disappearance of Flight 370 is not only terrifying as a result of the unanswered questions it raises, but also heartbreaking for the families of those who were never seen again. Even more chilling, no one is even quite sure as to why it happened.
2 switches were pulled in that cockpit.
And you say were pulled. That suggests deliberate.
Deliberate.
What kind of deliberate acts?
Well, maybe it was a hijacking.
Paris attacks.
The French president has declared a state of emergency and has sealed the country's borders. But Lester, we're hearing reports of shooters moving through that concert hall where the hostages were apparently killing people one by one. People are taking to social media to say, someone, please help us.
In 2015, France as a nation had maintained a heightened focus on security after a series of coordinated terrorist attacks on the Île-de-France administrative region in January. However, they were woefully underprepared for what was next to come.
My dear compatriots, at the moment that I speak to you, terrorist attacks of an unprecedented level are happening in the Paris area. There are dozens dead. There are many injured. It's a horror. We have, at my command, mobilized all possible forces so that we can neutralize the terrorist threat and secure all the areas that could be affected.
On Friday, November 13th, 3 separate groups of militants associated with the Brussels Islamic State terror cell carried out a series of attacks. One such attack, which took place at an Eagles of Death metal concert at the Bataclan, received massive international media coverage. That was for the fact that it resulted in the most casualties of any of the three attacks, with 90 deaths. Altogether, 130 people were killed and 416 injured.
What you can't see behind me is the hospital where many of the injured would have been taken last night, and people have actually been lining up there for hours, some of them as long as 4 hours, to donate blood. It's one way, they've said, that helps them feel like they can keep the fear at bay. They want to feel like they're doing something to help. Many people say that they feel helpless and afraid.
Great Recession.
The signs were everywhere, but now it's official. We are in a recession. The research group that makes that determination made it today and said the recession actually started a year ago. But the question now, when will it end? Wall Street is clearly worried. The Dow plunged nearly 680 points today, or 7.7%.
While some countries around the world were spared the worst of it, the late 2000s economic crisis wreaked significant havoc on nations thought to be untouchable, ostensibly the result of the bursting of the United States housing bubble and the devaluation of mortgage-backed securities. The Great Recession was described as the biggest financial nightmare since the Great Depression nearly 100 years earlier. Although the crisis was brought to a close in 2009, its ripple effects, including on employment, health, and politics, can still be felt today. These ripples remind us of the volatility and relative instability of the systems and institutions we trust implicitly.
Folks over 55 have not recovered from the recession. In fact, their unemployment rate has doubled since 2007. Half the folks at or near retirement age think they won't have enough money to retire. Half of seniors experiencing money trouble have put off medical or dental care or stopped taking their medications.
Rwandan genocide.
May 7. The massacres that have claimed up to 200,000 lives in Rwanda did not begin as a spontaneous outpouring of tribal rage, but rather as a systematic campaign of killing directed by political leaders and backed by the military.
Over the course of just 3 months, from April to July of 1994, a coalition of extremist Hutu militia groups in the East African nation of Rwanda killed as many as an estimated 800,000 Tutsis. This was in addition to 10,000 members of the Twa peoples, and up to 500,000 Tutsi women were sexually assaulted by Hutu militants.
June 10th. The commander of the small United Nations detachment in Rwanda conceded today that his efforts to broker a ceasefire in the civil war there have shown no signs of success. He predicted more fighting and more massacres. This was the Canadian General Romeo Dallaire who was deeply affected by his inability to stop this crisis going on.
The most infamous moment of the larger Rwandan Civil War, which began in 1990 before ending in July 1994. The deadly chaos was spurred on by the assassination of Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana. The genocide didn't end, per se. While the mass killings ceased, the conflict instead morphed into the First Congo War in 1996.
There was, I think, just a collective willingness back in the United States and in all the world capitals to put your heads in the sand. I mean, this was only 6 months after we had lost a huge number of Army Rangers during the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, and I think there was no appetite in Washington at that time to engage ourselves in another African tribal war.
Russian invasion of Ukraine.
After the U.S. warned all day of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was imminent, Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine, that Russia would bring in troops. He told Ukrainian troops to lay down arms and go home.
To be totally clear, it's worth noting that 2022 didn't mark the beginning of Russia's attempt to annex neighboring Ukraine. That began in 2014, kicking off an ongoing war effort. Having said that, 2022 marked a significant escalation in the conflict.
Yeah, the distinct sound of explosions on the horizon here in Kiev. We've heard at least 4 what appear to be strikes lighting up the night sky just in the last really 10 minutes or so. As you say, it looks like the darkest day has come to pass following this speech by Vladimir Putin.
On February 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation, which was largely interpreted by the international community as a euphemism for an all-out invasion. Amidst hundreds of thousands of civilian and military deaths, the Russia-Ukraine war has stoked global fears of what could happen if Putin achieves his goals.
Вот о чем речь. Ну поймите же вы в конце концов. Не мы кому-то угрожаем. Мы что ли пришли туда к границам США? Или к границам Великобритании? Или куда? К нам пришли.
So the two major goals for
Vladimir Putin is one, to kind of keep Ukraine close to Russia, and number two is to keep Ukraine away from the West.
The year 2000 problem.
When it comes to ringing in the millennium, home is where the party is, despite predictions a year ago that most revelers would celebrate big and travel far. Fears of the Y2K bug are keeping many people grounded, and most say they'll settle for being close to home with family and friends.
The computer chip is ruling the evening, absolutely.
Looking back, it's easy to dismiss fears of the so-called Y2K panic as nothing more than the ravings of a few fear-mongering conspiracy theorists. However, it should be pointed out that there was a very real potential for disaster looking ahead to the year 2000.
The federal government spent $8.5 billion. They estimate about $100 billion, Peter, spent by private industry in this country. So if people say, well, was this a hoax? Was this a hype? No, probably we're going to find out there was a real problem there, but they got it fixed.
The public was warned that inadequately prepared computers could lead to massive system failures, leading to some especially fearful believers' full-on apocalyptic prep. Any potential crisis was immediately prevented by the tireless work of programmers and engineers worldwide, which resulted in the laissez-faire attitude about Y2K that we often hear about today.
No major problems to report, not only in the United States, but in fact, throughout the world. Sam had talked earlier about countries that got started late dealing with the Y2K problems. There were concerns about the air traffic control systems in those countries, but there have been no problems reported at airports, with airlines, or in any of those systems, and they're just hoping that good news holds.
COVID-19 pandemic.
Good evening. As the pandemic of coronavirus claims more lives around the world, the people of the United Kingdom are now being advised to make drastic changes to their day-to-day existence. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, rejected criticism that his government had been slow to respond to the scale of this crisis.
Regardless of whether you thought COVID was a legitimate global health emergency or a deep state conspiracy to control the population, it's inarguable that it was a frightening, uncertain, and deeply challenging time. Even if you weren't personally affected by the coronavirus itself, you were undoubtedly hit by one of its side effects.
Yossi Sheffi is one of the world's leading supply chain experts and heads the department at MIT. He predicted years ago in a book that a pandemic would grind the world's supply chain to a halt, and even called for ventilators to be manufactured in the thousands to fend off a virus like COVID-19. And now we are seeing how consumer and pharmaceutical products will take a while to make a comeback in the U.S.
Those included the disruption of the global economy, supply chain shortages, and a moratorium on in-person encounters. Most of the fears stem from the confusion around the virus, as well as the heavy volume of social media disinformation about it. The World Health Organization still considers COVID to be an active pandemic, and it's likely that we'll be feeling its effects for years, possibly even generations to come.
The pandemic was associated with a rise in hospitalizations for mental health issues such as anxiety, self-harm, and eating disorders across Canada. That's according to a study conducted by Montreal researchers as a part of a larger project called Popcorn that looked into direct and indirect impacts of the pandemic.
Cuban Missile Crisis.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Perhaps the most notorious nuclear close call of all time, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not only the closest the Cold War ever came to full-on conflict, but an embarrassing misfire for the Soviet Union. In October 1962, the administration of American President John F. Kennedy deployed nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, and the Soviets responded by deploying missiles in Cuba, hence the name.
I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized.
The conflict de-escalated following President Kennedy's naval blockade around Cuba, which was followed by an agreement with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The agreement stipulated that the Soviet Union would dismantle its Cuban missiles in exchange for assurance that the U.S. would not try to invade Cuba again.
There was intense debate among his advisors, the president and his advisors, how best to respond, but everybody agreed that those missiles could not be tolerated.
The Soviet missile bases in Cuba are being dismantled, their missiles and related equipment are being traded, and the fixed installations at these sites are being destroyed.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. The events of September 11th, 2001. We don't think we need to get into the specifics of what remains the deadliest terror attack in not only American history, but the entire world's. With nearly 3,000 dead and as many as 25,000 wounded, 9/11 was an unmitigated disaster that changed history in an instant. Al-Qaeda terrorists, under the command of militant leader Osama bin Laden, took down the World Trade Center. Additional attacks on the same day failed to do the same amount of damage. The attacks in New York City forever changed the way that the United States looked at national security and spurred President George W. Bush's Iraq War. Which moment in our video shocked you the most? Are there any we missed? Be sure to let us know in the comments below.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.